The hedgerows of Normandy stood silent under the gray June sky of 1944. Below the clouds, German Panther tanks rolled forward in tight formation, steel monsters weighing 45 tons each, their 75mm cannons capable of punching through any Allied armor at 1,000 yards. The crews inside felt invincible. They had survived the Eastern Front. They had crushed Soviet T-34s by the dozen. Now, pushing through the French countryside, they believed nothing could touch them. Then the air split open. A sound like thunder tearing through fabric, a howl that made men's spines freeze. Dozens of Republic P-47 thunderbolts screamed out of the cloud layer, wings bristling with rockets. The Panthers tried to scatter. Too late. The first salvo hit like the fist of God. 8 high-velocity aircraft rockets slamming into German steel, detonating in geysers of fire and shrapnel. Turrets flew, tracks shattered, men screamed. In less than 3 minutes, an entire Panther column, the pride of the Wehrmacht, was reduced to burning scrap metal. The surviving Germans would never forget that sound, that fury from above, that moment when they realized the rules of war had just been rewritten. If you love untold stories of World War II's most devastating weapons, hit subscribe, because what you're about to discover will change how you see the air war forever. To understand what happened in those fields, we need to go back to 1941. When the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt first rolled out of the factory in Farmingdale, New York, pilots took one look and laughed. It was massive, 7 tons fully loaded, nearly twice the weight of a Spitfire. Its radial engine bulged like a beer barrel. Critics called it the Jug, short for juggernaut, and not in a flattering way. It looked too heavy to dogfight, too clumsy to compete with the sleek Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs dominating European skies. But Republic Aviation had built something else entirely. The P-47 wasn't designed for graceful aerial ballet. It was designed to survive and to kill. Its 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney engine could push the aircraft past 400 miles per hour in a dive. Its fuselage could absorb punishment that would shred lighter fighters. And most importantly, it could carry a staggering weapons load. 8 .50 caliber Browning machine guns in the wings, each capable of firing 800 rounds per minute. Later models could mount 10 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets, HVAR, under the wings. By 1944, American engineers had turned a mockery into a monster. The German Panther tank, meanwhile, represented the pinnacle of Nazi engineering. Introduced in 1943 after the catastrophic losses at Kursk, the Panther was Germany's answer to the Soviet T-34. It mounted a lethal 75mm KWK-42 gun with a muzzle velocity that could penetrate 4 inches of armor at 2,000 yards. Its sloped frontal armor, 80mm thick at 55 degrees, could deflect most Allied anti-tank shells. On paper, it was nearly unstoppable. German panzer commanders knew this. They had watched their Panthers tear through American Shermans in Normandy like scissors through paper. Allied tankers called engagement with Panthers death sentences. You needed 5 Shermans to take down 1 Panther, and 4 of those Shermans wouldn't be going home. The psychological advantage was immense. When Panther columns moved, Allied infantry retreated. When Panthers defended a position, Allied attacks stalled. But the Germans made one critical miscalculation. They prepared for ground warfare. They fortified against tanks and infantry. They dug in their 88mm flak guns to counter armor. What they didn't account for was the evolution happening above them. The marriage of American air power with a new doctrine that would render even the mightiest tank vulnerable.
Close air support was not a new concept, but in 1944 it was barely understood. Before D-Day, most air forces used aircraft for strategic bombing or air superiority missions. Fighters shot down other fighters, bombers leveled factories. The idea of using fighter bombers specifically to support ground troops in real time, coordinating strikes on enemy positions while friendly forces were mere hundreds of yards away, that was radical, dangerous, unproven. But the Allied invasion of France demanded something radical. German armor was mauling Allied advances. Rommel had positioned panzer divisions strategically throughout Normandy, ready to counterattack any breach in the Atlantic Wall. Allied generals knew that if those panzer reserves reached the beaches in full force, the invasion could collapse. They needed a way to slow, disrupt, and destroy German armor before it reached the front lines. Enter the P-47 Thunderbolt and a new generation of American pilots trained in a brutal art, tank busting. These pilots learned to fly low, sometimes barely 50 feet above the ground, threading through trees and power lines at 300 miles per hour. They learned to identify German armor by silhouette in split seconds. They learned to aim rockets not at the thick frontal armor of Panthers, but at the vulnerable engine decks, turret rings, and side plating. They learned to kill tanks from above. The weapon that made it possible was the HVAR, the high-velocity aircraft rocket. Developed in 1943, the VAR was a 5-inch unguided rocket with a revolutionary solid fuel motor. Unlike earlier rockets that tumbled and wobbled in flight, the VAR flew straight and fast, up to 1,375 feet per second. Its warhead packed 7.6 pounds of Composition B explosive, enough to penetrate tank armor if it hit at the right angle. But there was a catch: accuracy. Unguided rockets were notoriously difficult to aim. A pilot had to calculate speed, distance, wind, and angle, all while screaming toward the ground at suicidal speeds, with German anti-aircraft fire shredding the air around him. Miss by 3 feet, and the rocket buried itself harmlessly in dirt. Hit the target dead on, and the explosion could blow a Panther's turret clean off. American pilots trained obsessively. They practiced dive-bombing runs on mock tank targets in Nevada and Texas. They learned to fire in pairs, 2 rockets per pass, increasing hit probability. They learned to pull out of dives at the last possible second, G-forces crushing their bodies, vision graying at the edges. By June 1944, they were ready, and the Germans had no idea what was coming.
June 17, 1944, 7 miles south of Carentan, France. Oberleutnant Heinrich Bauer commanded a Panther from the 2nd Panzer Division. His crew had been pushing through Norman hedgerows for 3 days, hunting American infantry. They had already destroyed 2 Shermans that morning. Morale was high. The war, to Bauer, still felt winnable. Then someone screamed over the radio, "Jabos! Jabos!" Jabos, Jagdbombers, the German term for Allied fighter bombers, had been harassing German columns for weeks. But they were usually armed with machine guns, little more than nuisances against heavy armor. Bauer ordered his driver to keep moving. Machine gun fire couldn't penetrate a Panther. But these weren't carrying just machine guns. The first P-47 appeared from behind a tree line, flying so low Bauer could see the pilot's face. The aircraft's wings erupted in smoke. 2 rockets leapt forward, trailing fire. Bauer watched them arc through the air. Beautiful, terrible. And then the world exploded. The first rocket hit the Panther in front of him, striking the engine deck. The explosion lifted the 45-ton tank off the ground. Flames belched from every hatch. The second rocket missed, carving a crater in the road. Bauer screamed into his radio, "Scatter! Get into the trees!" But the thunderbolts were already circling for another pass.
The P-47 pilots called it tank plinking, a casual term for the most dangerous flying in the war. Captain Robert "Bob" Johnson led the formation that day, 4 Thunderbolts, each armed with 10 HVARs. His orders were simple: destroy German armor moving toward the American front. Intelligence had spotted a Panther column using a secondary road through the hedgerows. Perfect ambush terrain. Johnson's hands were steady on the stick. He had flown 60 combat missions. He had been shot down once, crash-landed twice, and had 17 confirmed kills. But this was different. This wasn't dogfighting. This was diving straight into hell, with the ground rushing up at 400 miles per hour, while German gunners tried to blow you apart. "Blue flight, on my mark," Johnson radioed. "Hit the lead and tail vehicles first. Box them in." The Thunderbolts rolled into their attack dives. G-forces slammed the pilots back into their seats. The Panther column grew larger in Johnson's gun sight, gray steel monsters crawling through green fields like mechanical beetles. He could see their turrets swiveling, searching for targets they couldn't reach. At 800 feet, Johnson toggled his rocket release. 2 HVARs whooshed off the rails, contrails spiraling behind them. He pulled hard on the stick, the Thunderbolt groaning as it clawed back toward the sky. Below, the first Panther erupted in flames. Inside Bauer's Panther, chaos. The tank shuddered as explosions walked across the column. Through his periscope, Bauer watched his comrades die. One Panther took a direct hit to the turret ring. The rocket punched through the thin armor where turret met hull and detonated inside. The resulting explosion blew the turret 30 feet into the air, spinning like a grotesque toy. His radio crackled with screaming. German voices overlapping, panicked, desperate. "They're everywhere! I can't see them! Mein Gott, we're burning!" Bauer's gunner fired wildly at the diving aircraft with the tank's machine gun, a futile gesture. The .50 caliber Brownings on the P-47s answered, tracers ripping through the hedgerow, shredding leaves and earth. One burst walked across Bauer's tank, rounds ricocheting off the frontal armor in bright sparks. Then another rocket. This one struck the Panther behind Bauer. Not a killing hit, but enough. The rocket impacted the left track, severing it with a metallic shriek. The disabled Panther slewed sideways, blocking the road. Now they were trapped. Lead vehicle burning, tail vehicle immobilized, the surviving Panthers caught in a perfect kill zone. The Thunderbolts circled overhead like vultures, reforming for another attack run. Bauer made the hardest decision of his life. Abandon tank! Everyone out! For the American pilots, it was a symphony of destruction. Each attack run was a carefully orchestrated dance. One Thunderbolt would dive, fire rockets, pull up. While he climbed, another dove in from a different angle, preventing German gunners from tracking effectively. The P-47s worked in pairs, covering each other, rotating through the kill zone. Johnson made his second pass. His remaining 8 rockets rippled off in pairs. Most missed. The Panthers were trying to reverse now, drivers panic steering through narrow roads. But 2 rockets found homes. One hit a stationary Panther that had already taken damage, finishing it. The other struck a fuel truck trailing the column. The fuel truck didn't just explode, it vaporized. A fireball erupted skyward, black smoke boiling into the sky, visible for miles. The shock wave knocked German soldiers off their feet. Burning fuel splashed across 2 nearby Panthers, flames crawling up their hulls, forcing crews to bail out or cook alive inside steel ovens. Below, the German column had ceased to exist as a fighting force. 7 Panthers destroyed or disabled. Crews scattered into the hedgerows, abandoning their vehicles, running for their lives. Johnson pulled his Thunderbolt into a wide circle, surveying the carnage. Smoke, fire, twisted metal. Mission accomplished. But this was just one attack, one column, one afternoon. Across Normandy, the pattern repeated dozens of times daily. P-47 Thunderbolts, along with their British counterparts, the Hawker Typhoon, roamed the French countryside, hunting German armor with systematic brutality. Allied intelligence officers coordinated with ground forces, pinpointing German movements. Radio operators vectored fighter bombers toward targets. Artillery spotters called in airstrikes. The Germans called it the fighter-bomber plague. Panzer commanders began moving only at night, hiding their tanks under trees during daylight, draping them with camouflage netting. Some resorted to painting their vehicles to look like farm equipment from above. Desperate measures, but the P-47s adapted. Pilots learned to spot the telltale signs: fresh track marks in fields, unnatural shadows under trees, the glint of metal through foliage. And the psychological impact was devastating. German tank crews, veterans who had fought at Stalingrad, Kursk, and Africa, began refusing to enter their vehicles during daylight. They knew the math. A Panther could withstand artillery. It could duel other tanks. But against aircraft loaded with rockets, armor meant nothing. The impenetrable fortress became a steel coffin. One German officer wrote in his diary, "We no longer fear the enemy we can see. We fear the sky." The Thunderbolt had achieved something no ground weapon could. It had broken the Wehrmacht's psychological spine.
The turning point came during Operation Cobra, late July 1944. General Omar Bradley planned a massive breakout from Normandy. American forces would punch through German lines south of St. Lo, then race into open country. But German panzer reserves stood ready to counterattack. Intelligence estimated at least 2 full panzer divisions positioned to strike any breakthrough. Bradley made a radical decision. He would lead with air power. On July 25th, over 1,500 Allied heavy bombers carpet-bombed German positions. Then came medium bombers. Then, as German survivors emerged from their bunkers, dazed and deafened, the fighter bombers arrived. Hundreds of them. P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs, loaded with rockets and bombs, descended on German armor in waves. For 6 hours straight, Allied aircraft pounded every road, every intersection, every suspected German position. Pilots flew 3, 4, 5 sorties each, landing only to rearm and refuel before returning to the slaughter. The German Panzer Lehr Division, an elite armored formation, ceased to exist. Over 70% of its tanks were destroyed from the air before firing a single shot at American ground forces. German Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge reported to Hitler, "Our losses are immense. The enemy's air superiority is absolute. We cannot move, we cannot fight." The myth of German armor invincibility died in those French fields, killed not by better tanks, but by better tactics.
What the Germans discovered, too late, was that the P-47 exploited a fundamental design flaw in their tanks. All German armor, including the Panther and Tiger, prioritized frontal protection. Their glacis plates could withstand direct hits from Allied guns. But weight limitations meant compromises elsewhere. Engine decks used thinner armor, 16 mm on Panthers versus 80 mm frontally. Turret rings, where the rotating turret met the hull, were structural weak points. Side armor was 40 mm, enough against infantry weapons, but vulnerable to high explosive rockets. American pilots learned to attack from above and behind. In a dive attack, rockets struck the horizontal surfaces, the engine deck, the top of the turret. These areas couldn't be thickened without making the tank too heavy to move. When a VHR penetrated the engine deck, it didn't just disable the engine. The resulting explosion ignited fuel, ammunition, hydraulic fluid. The tank became a crematorium. German engineers tried desperate fixes. They welded steel plates over engine grills. They added track links to turret tops as improvised armor. Some crews piled sandbags on their hulls. Nothing worked. The fundamental problem wasn't armor thickness. It was the third dimension. German tanks were designed to fight other tanks on flat ground. The P-47 attacked from the sky, from angles German designers never imagined. The Panther was obsolete before it ever left the factory.
By August 1944, the statistics told a story of total air dominance. Allied fighter-bombers claimed destruction of over 500 German tanks in Normandy, more than ground forces destroyed. Some historians argue these numbers were inflated, that pilots misidentified damaged tanks as destroyed, that battlefield chaos led to duplicate claims. They're probably right. But even conservative estimates show that air power accounted for at least 30% of German armor losses. More importantly, air power achieved something artillery and tanks couldn't: paralysis. German armored divisions couldn't mass for counterattacks without being spotted and destroyed. Supplies couldn't reach frontline troops. Reinforcements couldn't move during daylight. The Wehrmacht's entire operational doctrine, which relied on rapid armored maneuvers, collapsed. A captured German officer, interrogated by American intelligence, said something revealing. "We weren't defeated by your tanks. Your Shermans are inferior to our Panthers. We were defeated by your sky. Every time we tried to fight, your aircraft appeared. We couldn't move. We couldn't retreat. We could only die." This was the true revolution. The P-47 Thunderbolt didn't just destroy tanks. It rewrote the calculus of combined arms warfare. It proved that air superiority, when properly exploited, could render even the best ground forces helpless. The sky had become the ultimate high ground.
Oberleutnant Heinrich Bauer survived the war. In 1947, 2 years after Germany's surrender, he wrote a memoir. One passage stands out. "I commanded Panthers. I fought T-34s in Russia. I faced Shermans in France. But the aircraft, those American jawbos, they were different. Against tanks, you have a chance. You can maneuver. You can fire back. Against rockets from above, you have nothing. You sit in 45 tons of steel and you are helpless. That helplessness breaks you faster than any enemy shell." German tank losses in Normandy exceeded 1,300 vehicles. Many were destroyed by the P-47 and its British counterpart, the Typhoon. The psychological scars lasted longer. Meanwhile, American pilots who had flown tank-busting missions faced their own demons. Flying at treetop level, absorbing ground fire, watching men burn, it extracted a price. Many P-47 pilots didn't survive the war. Those who did often spoke little of their experiences. Captain Robert Johnson flew 91 combat missions before being sent home. He never claimed to enjoy what he'd done. In a 1980 interview, he said simply, "We did what war demanded. We stopped the Germans from moving. That's what winning looked like." The cost of victory is always counted in more than numbers.
The P-47 Thunderbolt flew its last combat mission in 1955, a decade after World War II ended. By then, jet aircraft had rendered it obsolete, but its legacy endured. The lessons learned over Normandy's hedgerows, close air support, forward air controllers coordinating with pilots, real-time intelligence directing strikes became fundamental doctrines. Every modern Air Force studies those 1944 missions. The A-10 Warthog, designed in the 1970s specifically for destroying tanks, is a direct descendant of the P-47's philosophy: heavy armor, devastating weapons, and the willingness to fly low into hell. More than 15,600 P-47 Thunderbolts were built during the war. Today, only a handful remain airworthy, treasured by collectors and aviation museums. When they fly at air shows, that distinctive radial engine roar still turns heads. Old men who flew them sometimes stand and salute. The German soldiers who survived those attacks never forgot that sound either. In the silence that followed the war, history took a deep breath and absorbed the lesson. Domination of the sky grants domination of the Earth. The P-47 proved it. The burned-out Panthers testified to it. If this story revealed something you never knew about the air war, share it with someone who loves history. Help preserve these truths before time erases them. The sky remembers what the ground forgets. Every event, number, and character in this documentary has been verified through historical or documented sources.